Hey everybody, what is going on? Hexlex here with another Master Duel video for you guys. So today we are coming back to I don't know if you can quite call it a series or it's just a video, type of video that I like to do every now and then. That is going to be our metagame analysis. And it's been a little bit since we have done one, mostly because with the new pack coming out, of course, it takes time for the meta to become defined and to pan out, especially when the pack is as game-changing as this one, right? Of course, when what was it called? Radiant Wings or something? When the Exorcister pack came out, we didn't really see too much of a shift in the meta, but aside from the addition of the, I would say rogue tier deck of Exorcisters, but of course with this latest pack here, which included both the Adventure and Floowandereeze cards, that saw a huge, significant shakeup in the metagame, as of course we all knew it would, and that of course has shaken up the tier list here as well. Now, there is one thing that I always mention, but is going to be especially important. I mean, it's always important, but it's especially important for this particular metagame analysis. So, when we were analyzing the tier list, when we were analyzing the tier list from masterduelmeta.com here, which I think is where a lot of people get their kind of metagame information, at least here in the West, and that actually is kind of going to be a factor. I think I'll explain that here in a second. I think this is one of the main sites that we turn to, right, for Master Duel specifically, and as a result, this ends up being the tier list that a lot of people see, and because Master Duel Meta also integrates data from decks that have been made, Diamond or Diamond 1, as well as the tournament decks. I think some people might assume, I mean, even though it says it up here, but we all know how good Yu-Gi-Oh players are about reading, right? I think some people might mistakenly assume that this data is also pulling from both tournaments and the metagame, or the ranked ladder rather, and that is definitely not the case, as it very clearly states up here again, is automatically updating using tournament topping decks from all community tournaments. So the fact that this tier list is only representing tournaments, again, has always been an important factor, but in the past I've often felt that the tier list represents the ranked ladder meta well enough, right, that it is a good enough stand-in. I don't know that that is necessarily the case with this particular tier list. I think now more than ever, it is important to note the distinction, the fact that this tier list is only representing the tournament decks. And the main reason I say that is because of, as far as adventure decks go, the overwhelming power of Prank Kids as opposed to Phantom Knights and Adventure Tenyi, right? So it's easy to look at this and be like, oh, Adventure Prank Kids is just by and far the best adventure deck, period. And on ranked ladder, in tournaments, I would obviously agree with that. The data just clearly reflects that here. Ranked ladder, I think the answer is a bit more nuanced. Now, I still think Adventure Prank Kids is definitely tier 1 on ranked ladder. There's no denying that. You're actually going to be seeing, probably the next video from me is going to be more of me playing with Adventure Prank Kids and really just showing just how powerful the deck is. But there's no denying that it is definitely tier 1 on ranked ladder. That's not what I'm arguing. Rather, I'm arguing that the power discrepancy, I don't believe, is quite as dramatic when it comes to talking specifically about ranked ladder, right? So Adventure Phantom Knight and Adventure Tenyi, Adventure Phantom Knight I do actually need to play with more, but I have played quite a bit with Adventure Tenyi, and the criticisms for the deck are valid. The main one being that, yes, the Hulk Auroradon line is very, very powerful, but the deck's a little bit of a one-trick pony in that, specifically Auroradon, because you can also go, the number 42 into Auroradon, or potentially a Barricade Board Blocker and a token into Auroradon. Your Auroradon line is more or less your one shot, right? It's a very, very powerful combo, but if it does manage to get stopped or interrupted, which to be fair, the deck also does have a good resilience against being interrupted, but if you get interrupted after already committing the Auroradon, it can be very hard to come back. And I think that's why Adventure Tenyi is ranked so low here on this particular tier list when it comes to community tournaments, right? Is because, yes, in a tournament format, the more consistent decks are going to shine. That's generally true on ranked ladder too, but it's more so true in the community tournaments, not only because of some of them being best of 3 and including side decking. That is very, very much a factor. Adventure Tenyi is a deck that I think definitely does worse in a best of 3 format, because it's it's a one-trick pony, and when you can get specifically hate on that one trick, then it becomes a lot easier to just completely shut you out of the match as a whole, as opposed to just one game. Game 1, which Adventure Tenyi can pretty easily steal by managing to play through a couple of hand gates and still getting a Halki Fibrax on board. Because as we all know from the combo guide, as long as you can get a Halki Fibrax on board, Adventure Tenyi can do their full combo, more or less their full combo. I think the same is generally true of Adventure Phantom Knight, although I think more the case with Adventure Phantom Knight, at least what I found when I played the deck, is that because we open less starters than other combo decks in this format, the deck is slightly less consistent, but it seems that the sheer variety of plays already makes it a decent, and again in reference to tournaments, a decent step above Adventure Tenyi, and also I imagine has an easier time side decking. The other thing too about Adventure Tenyi in best of 3 is it strikes me as a deck that would be difficult to side stuff in and out. It just seems like it'd be kind of odd to do that necessarily, but. And then, of course, another adventure deck we have here is actually Virtual World. This Virtual World list represented here. They do actually play adventure cards. It's really weird. Sometimes it seems kind of arbitrary because there are decks with adventure cards, but they don't get labeled as adventure decks. But I would call it Adventure Virtual World. So. And then there's always the anti-meta stand-ins of Eldlich and Floowandereeze. It's interesting to see Sword Soul Tenyi still so high. I don't know if that's being left over from... I'd have to do a little bit more research digging into dates. Well, we can actually do that when we go into Sword Soul Tenyi's page here in a bit. We'll dig into and we'll look at the dates, because I'm really interested to see if Sword Soul Tenyi has just been seeing consistent tournament play even through the new stuff coming out, or if this is still just leftover data from last season or recent times. But yeah, so I think that's about all I have to say about the list as a whole. Now, as I often do with these videos, we're going to go into each individual deck, take a look at their deck breakdown, talk about how the deck functions, why it is where it is on the tier list, and so on and so forth. So let's go straight into Adventure Prank Kids. Okay, so we are here on the deck statistics page for Adventure Prank Kids, and when it comes to utilizing Master Duel meta in terms of deck building and analyzing card choices and how decks are built, this is by and far on my page for any given deck. Of course, it does make sense to also look through the individual deck lists down here as well, but this is when I'm looking at multiple deck lists, this is all the information I'm looking for. So as always, I gotta give a huge shout out to MasterDuelMeta.com for this feature. It's literally exactly what I'm looking for. So with Adventure Prank Kids, right, and this is something I didn't really realize when I had actually built Adventure Prank Kids the first time. Again, I do have some games set aside in a video that will likely come out either tomorrow or the next day, where we'll go into more of a nuanced look at Adventure Prank Kids, as opposed to a more general one where we're going to take a look at here. But the deck actually is changed fairly significantly in how it's built now that the adventure cards are out. I kind of made the mistake of taking a standard Prank Kids deck, taking out the cards that I thought weren't needed, and then just putting in the adventure cards. But it is actually important to build it a certain way, and that way is kind of it's actually not kind of, it is fairly apparent here in the number of copies of each of these cards being used, right? So obviously Roxy's is at 2 because it was a weird hit to Adamantipator that is still around for some reason. And then Fansies generally played at 2, whereas we played 3 before. And then even you'll see Lampsies is, half builds are playing 3, half are playing 2, and some builds decide to go down to 2 Dropsies. So, the main reason that you're seeing kind of a discrepancy here is that, from what I can tell, the generally kind of practice of how many Prank Kids main deck monsters to include is 3 of one and then 2 of all the others, and then 3 Prank Kids place, which will give you a good variety of things to search based on how many copies you still have left in your deck. I made the mistake of just including 3 of each Prank Kids monster and then only 1 place, but you definitely don't need, you didn't need it before, right? You didn't necessarily need that many Prank Kids monsters to combo off, but now that we have the adventure cards and some other tech that is demanding the card space, we definitely need to be a bit more mindful of the ratioing. And it's better to take out some of the unnecessary, even though it might seem weird because the main deck Prank Kid monsters are core to the combo. It's definitely better to take out some of those than some of the disruption that we were taking out, or some of the consistency like Prank Kids place. So Again, we'll cover that more as we go into the actual Adventure Prank Kids video, which again will be coming up soon. So as far as how else Adventure, or not Adventure, well, just Prank Kids in general has changed, you know, we're seeing Foolish Burial, of course, be included as part of the Adventure engine. You know, Foolish Burial is kind of one of those cards that, like, it's generally good in most decks that are playing Adventure decks, but this is actually one of the ones where we don't really use Foolish for anything. It's literally just here for the Adventure stuff. See, most decks are still also playing the DPE engine. That's the other reason why it's important. Well, that's the other thing too. That's I took out the DPE engine in order to make room for Adventure stuff, which definitely, because you know, at the time I mistakenly valued the main deck Prank Kids monsters as higher, but it's definitely better to have, in this case, a variety of options as opposed to you know, only relying on the Prank Kids line. And plus, when you're playing 3 of each Prank Kid, then you open like more than 2 often enough that it's like, which you only ever need 2. It's really easy to open 3+ and generally not worth it. As far as how the extra deck has changed, we're definitely seeing a noticeable drop in Totally Awesome and Rip Roar and Roaster, as we're now including Link Spiders. The Link Spiders are being included as a counter to, well, pretty much Nibiru, actually. No, not only just Nibiru, using the token to make a Link Spider and then using that to go into the Vert Anaconda, but also now that we're playing the Adventure line, it's pretty easy to pick up a spare. You know, if your play gets interrupted and you need to just go into a Vert and DPE to have something, then you can use the Adventure token to make a Link Spider to help him make that Vert Anaconda. So that can be useful when you get Ash, like in particular, right? Like if you're, like, let's say both your Fateful Adventure and Prank Kids searches get stopped, which is a little rare, honestly. It's one of the reasons Adventure Prank Kids is so good, is because you have so many different things that need to be stopped, and your opponent's only going to have so many answers. But in a case where both get stopped and you're just left with like Meow Meow Moo and your Adventure token, then yeah, you can just send the token away for a Link Spider and then link those into a Vert Anaconda, and again, at the very least, you'll have a DPE at that point. And then, yeah, Rip Roar and Roaster and Totally Awesome are generally just 2 of the less important cards. I am still playing Rip Roar and Roaster in my extra deck because I do still think, like, the back row wipe is, it's not, like, as important as it was before. We are seeing significantly less back row heavy decks being played, but one, I suspect that will change when, you know, the ladder updates for Season 8, and then also probably in the Duelist Cup, just in any generally competitive, you know, moments, I guess, within the Master Duel ladder and or again the upcoming Duelist Cup, you'll probably see more Eldliches and back row based decks floating around. And then also, I just, you know, I'm still not in a place where I feel like I need a second Battle Butler. We're actually seeing 1 Battle Butler seeing more play over 2, which before I think 2 was like, it was slightly more common to see 2. Now with extra XP being a little bit tighter, we're seeing more people play 1 copy, but you only ever really needed 1 copy anyway. Alright, so I think that's about all I have to say about the Adventure Prank Kids deck. Let's go ahead and take a look at the next one. Alright, so the next list or the next deck rather, we're going to take a look at here is the breakdown for Sword Soul Tenyi. So, like I mentioned, I was curious if this was leftover data or if Sword Soul Tenyi was just still doing that well in tournaments, and so one of the easiest ways to tell that is to actually come down here and look at recent decks. Another very handy thing, as it'll show you, you know, recent decks that have done well, whether they have gotten Diamond 1 or Diamond, or whether they've gone, you know, done so well in a tournament. And the other cool thing, if you're on desktop, I believe, or maybe some other, I don't know if it's weird because on my laptop it doesn't do this, but on my desktop it does, where if you hover over it, it'll even show you the list without having to click on it. So that's always nice as well. So yeah, it actually does seem like, if you look at the dates here, I mean, you know, I'm actually recording this on the 28th, so this is all pretty much very recent here. Within the last 4 days, we're still seeing this many Sword Soul Tenyi decks being played, not just in tournaments, but on ladder as well. So I think it's really easy to underestimate, you know, the old decks. When new decks come in, it's like, oh, all this adventure stuff is out. Why would we think about Sword Soul Tenyi? That's like the old good deck. Well, no, it's still actually a very, very good deck, and is definitely not to be underestimated. I think we'll start seeing a lot more Sword Soul Tenyi come back on ladder, again, when the season updates for Season 8, and also on the 9th when the Duelist Cup begins. I think we'll see Sword Soul Tenyi kind of re-emerge. I think a lot of the reason we haven't been seeing it a lot lately is because, you know, obviously we just had before the new pack came out, a very Sword Soul intensive format, where Sword Soul was seen very much like all over the place, especially when it came time for laddering and ranking up to Diamond 1. The climb in Diamond was like almost exclusively like Sword Soul, Tenyi, and then Eldlich and Numeron and all the other, you know, usual suspects you see while laddering up. But in any case, yeah, Sword Soul Tenyi definitely not to be underestimated just because it is not seeing play. That's the thing that's always important to like note, right? It's just because you're not seeing a deck a lot doesn't mean the deck is bad or has gotten worse. There are definitely more factors than just how good a deck is that factor into how often people play it, how many people play it, and how many people, you know, want to play it. So if we look at the trends here, we're seeing some interesting downward trends in the Halcororodon line, of course the Despot as well as the Protoss. Funnily enough, when the deck first came out, I was kind of adamant, not about adamant necessarily, I was fairly open to changing my mind, which I'd like to think I did, you know, relatively reasonable amount of time, but I was like, you know, the deck doesn't need these cards to function, right? But they are very, very good and very important. Now, even though we're seeing downward trends, it's obviously still like 80% of decks are using the Halc line, 83 are still using Protoss, so that's probably not down a too significant much, and you know, we're still seeing the vast majority of these decks play it. But I think what I suspect is the reason that we're not seeing, or we're seeing these downward trends rather, is because the people who are still, some of the people who are still interested in playing Sword Soul Tenyi are definitely interested in like the archetype itself, and so they are more inclined likely to play a pure version. That's also why you'll see, even though they don't have like upward trend arrows, I've just noticed since the last time I've personally looked at this deck breakdown that you know, this number for Heavenly Dragon Circle has definitely gone up. It was definitely not at 38%. I think it was close to like 22% last time I looked. Same with Shathana. Shathana was at like 25% last time I looked. Now it's actually at 52%. The majority of decks that are, well, the majority of Sword Soul Tenyi decks, obviously, are playing Tenyi Spirit Shathana, which is quite interesting to me, so. And then, of course, we're seeing an upward trend in Imperm as well. Just Imperm, you know, continuing to be, it was also very good in the Sword Soul Tenyi meta, but still continues to be very, very good in this meta, where it's really easy to negate, like, you know, Halks and Auroradons that are running around, or just various other combo pieces. Like, onboard negation is pretty much as good. It's definitely better now than it was at the very start of Master Duel, which was still, it was still fine then, but you know, Imperm, when Drytrons were around in full force, Imperms and Veilors tended not to go quite as far, but since then, especially with the advent of Sword Soul Tenyi and then other decks afterward, it definitely makes sense why we're seeing an increased trend here. But otherwise, it doesn't seem like Sword Soul Tenyi has changed too much here, so definitely still a very viable and fairly powerful option if you have the deck from last, you know, kind of format, and or not format, but you know what I mean, but from before the pack came out, and you're still not like sure that you know any of the new decks well enough, don't feel bad about turning back to Sword Soul Tenyi. It's definitely still, it's probably still just a tier 1 deck. You can make an argument that it might be upper tier 2, but I think it's tier 1, honestly, still. Alright, let's take a look at the next deck here. Okay, so here we have Virtual World, which again, I think this should be Adventure Virtual World, because as you can see, we have the Adventure engine in 94% of decks. Like, I think that's pretty clearly, you know, an adventure deck to me, but I don't know, it seems a little arbitrary. But in any case, Virtual World, aside from the adventure cards being included, really hasn't changed too much. Actually, that's not true. It has. Not only in that the adventure cards were included, but they've definitely now seemed to have firmly ousted the Punk cards, right? Well, I think actually in MasterDuelMeta.com, Punk Virtual World is its own classification, but definitely from what I've seen from builds on ladder, I've seen less of the Punk ones and more of the adventure ones. And I think adventure is probably the way to go. The whole point of the Punk engine was to kind of bait out negates, which adventure not only baits out the negates, but then also does so by putting an Omni negate on board, which can then prevent further negates if it doesn't get negated. So tends to be pretty good, as that was Virtual World's kind of main weakness, right? Was that it's pretty it's not that it's very disruptible. It is actually a little bit less disruptible than other decks in regards to that it doesn't really get hit by like Veilors and Imperms, but it's one of those decks that like can be a little bit bricky, and then, you know, it's kind of one ash away from not being able to really do anything. So in that regard, the adventure engine definitely helps out. I'm glad too, because I recently invested in Virtual World and was hoping the deck would still be good after the adventure stuff came out, because you didn't really see it too much on the OCG metagame reports. But that's actually another important reason, one of many, I guess I should say, important reasons why Master Duel meta needs to be distinct from the OCG meta or TCG meta that had similar card releases, because we definitely have very different ban lists, as True King of all Calamities still being around, which I don't believe it was in the OCG or TCG by the time all this stuff came out. I don't know that for sure actually, but in any case, the fact that it's around is definitely not a lot. Well, I guess, yeah, I will say a large part. It's not that Virtual World is bad without this card, but I mean, let's be real. This card's existence does very much keep Virtual World more relevant than it would be otherwise. It's still a very fun deck, though, of course, to play, and still a fairly strong deck here. As you can see here, it's got a little bit less representation than a lot of the other decks. It hasn't seen quite as much play recently, but we can see that the engines that are rather, the decks that are using it are very much utilizing the adventure engine. Again, we see 94%, the vast majority of decks using the adventure engine. That definitely seems to be the way to go. Also, with the inclusion of the adventure engine, we're seeing the inclusion of Baron de Fleur in the extra deck, as it is possible with a level 3 tuner and the Griffin to make Baron, which might seem a bit redundant. Like, why would you want to turn your Omni Negate into another Omni Negate when you could use that level 3 for another play? But there are times when your play gets negated, or sometimes maybe if you're going second, you can OTK by getting rid of a card on the board with Baron's effect. There's definitely enough scenarios where it comes up that I think Baron de Fleur is worth an inclusion if you are playing the adventure engine, which I think, again, the vast majority of virtual world decks should be doing. We're seeing a little bit less of the Xyz engine as a result of that, less Break Swords, a noticeable downward trend in Gaia Dragons, and the Virtual World Phoenix Fan. Actually, still 72% are playing Fan, and I'm a huge fan. I'm a huge fan. So I didn't even intend for that pun, honestly. That just kind of came out, but yeah. So that is definitely still a card I would include in the extra deck personally. I think this card is so strong. And then, of course, we're seeing all the usual level 9 Macon suspects that we can go into the truest king of all those calamities. So yeah, I mean, not really much else to say about Virtual besides it's playing adventure now, like a lot of other stuff. Alright, let's go ahead and take a look at the next deck. Okay, so good old Eldlich. I personally have not really seen much Eldlich at all since the new decks came out, but of course, I also haven't laddered. Like, I got to Diamond 1 just before the new pack came out, so I'm sure there's still plenty of Eldliches out there in force on the climb up to Diamond 1. We're seeing even Eldlich adapt the adventure engine, not as much as other decks, only 37%, but the engine is still very, very splashable in Eldlich, as Right isn't going to stop. I mean, this deck doesn't normal summon ever anyway, so Right isn't really going to stop that. Of course, Lord of the Heavenly Prison still seeing a good amount of play in this deck as well, just being a very powerful, I want to say low commitment, but what I mean by that is, like, you don't have to, it's not like an extra deck monster where you have to sink multiple resources, or multiple monsters at least, to get this out and get this powerful an effect. You can just reveal it from your hand and play it right away. So very, very strong option for Eldlich. We're seeing an increase in play, I've noticed, in like Solemn Judgments and Golden Lane Forevers and Imperial Order, all these negates, and I definitely think that is 100% because of the adventure engine. Negating those spell cards, negating that Rite of Armiseer, negating that Fateful Adventure becomes a lot more important. So Imperial Order already very, very good for the deck, but definitely it wouldn't make sense to me that's why we're seeing the increase of these kind of negation cards. Similarly, I'm noticing a downward trend in Pot of Extravagance and upward in Prosperity. I think the adventure engine has made Prosperity a much better card as a whole, not just for decks that are playing adventure cards, because Prosperity is a good way to dig for your adventure engine to go into it before you start making your other plays, but also for decks that are looking to play against it, right? I'm betting that, a lot of the reason these Eldlich decks are kind of turning towards Prosperity is to, again, not only find the adventure stuff that they're playing, if they're playing it, but also find, like, your Imperial Order, to find your Solemn Judgment, to find your Golden Land Forevers, to stop your opponent's adventure engine from going off. Now, I'm not an Eldlich player I mean, I've played the deck before, but that was like a long... I mean, I've actually done a deck profile on it, but that's the last time I've played the deck, I'm pretty sure. Unless I just like messed around with it. I don't remember. Anyway, my main point is that I'm not like a regular player of Eldlich, so I'm kind of just making, not assumptions, but logical conclusions. We'll say it that way, just based on the statistics of what I know about the meta here. So, okay, let's go ahead and look at the next deck. So here we have Floowandereeze, good old Floos, as the next deck, which is definitely, I think, everybody's new least favorite anti-meta deck. Move over Eldlich, you have a, you are now slightly less hated as people are directing their hatred elsewhere. Floowandereeze, we're seeing a lot of what you would expect to see. The extra deck you can mostly disregard. I mean, it's not a bad idea to have like Assembled Nightingale, Downward Zeus, Access Code, just generally good stuff. But like, yeah, stuff like Hulk is obviously a meme. The Entity Natis, I don't think is actually a meme. I think there is sometimes a way to use this, but I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. But in any case, the extra deck is mostly irrelevant here. Of course, we're mainly just looking at the main deck here for the Floowandereeze statistics. So we're seeing a lot of what we expected to see, right? Your Floowandereeze cards, your Prosperities, your Dualities, your Mega Raiza, your Barrier Statues, Dimension Shifters seeing play an 87% as a 3 of, so definitely one of the more optimal disruption / hand trap cards to have in this deck, and as a result we're seeing Maxi being utilized as more of a among these like tech choices, right? Only seeing play as a 3 of and 24%, over 50% deck. The majority of Floowandereeze decks not even playing Maxi. But Dimension Shifter is definitely very much like Maxi in that it's kind of you play this and often enough your opponent will just have to end their turn without doing anything. So definitely a fine substitute there. We're seeing the Book of Moons, of course. Most decks are playing them to get around the Imperms and the Veilers, which is yet another deck that Imperm is seeing more play of as a result because of Floowandereeze being around and people just wanting to, be able to play around the birds. You see, there's a decent amount of tech stuff too, like Evenly Matched looks like it's on the rise. I can actually see that being very, very good in this deck, so I might even try that out myself. Vanity's Emptiness, for those who own it, it's a good option. Dark Ruler No More is interesting because I feel like you tend to see this more in like combo based decks, which I guess Floowandereeze does kind of combo, but not in a way where I would expect to see Dark Ruler No More, but interesting all the same. So yeah, I don't know that there's necessarily really much else to say about Floowandereeze. As you can see, it's a very, very popular deck in both ladder and tournaments. And again, it makes sense. It's relatively cheap. You do have to craft a 3-dimension shifter, but otherwise, if you've already got a decent amount of staples, then the deck doesn't really require any other ultra rares. So very, very nice and buildable in that regard. Would definitely expect to see a lot more Floowandereeze when we ladder at the start of Season 8, and then again in the Duelist Cup. Again, just generally the more competitive that an environment tends to be, then the more we tend to see of those like anti-meta style decks, which again, I don't really blame people for playing them. I mean, when I played the game in real life, I often played anti-meta decks, but it is something you need to watch out for. So all right, let's go and take a look at the next deck. All right, so the next deck we're going to take a look at here is Adventure Phantom Knight, which I do actually kind of want to revisit pretty soon here just to get a better idea of how I feel about playing this deck and whether it's the kind of deck I would want to ladder with. As far as the builds themselves go, we're seeing not like actually that much variety. If you look, even like down here, because usually it gets, once you get down to this point, you're kind of like in tech choice land, but like the vast majority of decks are still playing cards that are even represented in the bottom row here. So that is kind of the thing about Adventure Phantom Knight, is that yes, the inclusion of the Adventure Engine does a lot for the Phantom Knights. But at the same time, it does also kind of force you to take out a lot of those extenders, which is the thing I'm a little bit hesitant about with the Adventure Phantom Knight. Just in my experience playing them, I just noticed it was a little bit harder to open combo starters, not significantly. I think the deck is still more than fine, but Yeah, it is an observation I've made. It definitely obviously makes a lot more sense now why they preemptively put Torn Scales to 2 in order to hit this deck, as if this card was at 3, I think even just that third copy of Torn Scales would be such an improvement to the consistency of the deck that it would definitely be seeing a noticeably higher power level and play rate in the meta. But as it stands, you know, we've got the 2 copies, and that's still enough to make do with. Interesting to see upward trend arrows, and actually relatively, from what I would think anyway, low statistics for Scythe and Dagda. I thought being able to Scythe lock on top of the Adventure engine was kind of the main appeal of Adventure Phantom Knight, but it only seems like, and even then relatively recently, that the majority of only barely, I should say, the majority of Adventure Phantom Knight decks are even doing the Scythe lock thing. Yep, and then you can see, you know, cutting out the fluff from the extra deck as we're making room for things like Link Spider, like Dagda. You know, we're seeing less Downards, we're seeing definitely less IPs and less Moral Swords as well, as these are kind of like, not want to say gimmicky, they definitely have their function, but they're definitely less vital than, you know, anything else that we have here, so. And it looks like the deck sees a relatively like steady amount of play. I was curious to see how often people were playing this deck. This is about what I had in mind. It's a little bit better than what I had in mind, actually. So, yep, definitely good to see the deck still being utilized. And again, I do kind of intend to go back to it. I'd like to before Season 7 is over, but we'll just have to see at this point. Alright, we've got one more deck to take a look at. Let's go ahead and jump straight into it. Okay, last deck we're looking at here is Adventure Tenyi. And like I touched on earlier in the video when we looked at the tier list as a whole, I think that Adventure Tenyi would definitely have a higher power level rating on a purely ranked ladder as opposed to tournament only metagame analysis, or metagame analysis. And I don't know that it would significantly affect it. I do honestly think that in the Master Duel meta right now, Adventure Tenyi on ranked ladder is still probably like, I'd say upper tier 2, but it's probably still tier 2. That said, I'm still a huge fan of the deck. I think it's a lot of fun to play. I think the combo lines are really cool. I like how freeform it can feel. So I'm probably just going to end up laddering with this deck a fair bit anyway. Of course, it's like, you know, oh no, a tier 2 deck instead of a tier 1 deck. Like, even rogue tier decks are far more than capable of hitting Diamond 1. So don't feel like me saying that is like, oh, if you have to go to a tier 2 deck because you like it. You know, no, it's still more than fine to hit Diamond 1 with, but yeah, Adventure Tenyi is kind of one of those decks a little bit similar to Adventure Phantom Knight, where we're seeing most of the deck tends to stay the same or pretty similar. Like, even as we get down to this point, we're still seeing only like 85% of decks total are playing some amount of imperms, right? You know, 80% of decks are using the Emergence and Protoss. Well, I guess only 75% are using Protoss. It's kind of interesting. And then down here we get to more like tech stuff. But yeah, Adventure Tenyi, you know, obviously still seeing a lot of play. We see a lot of play here, especially on the ranked ladder. That's kind of one of the things I wanted to look forward to here. And that I noticed is that we are seeing a lot more of the ranked ladder lists as opposed to like tournament lists, as again, this deck just tends to do much better in a best of 1 format as opposed to best of 3, or even just in tournaments in general. Just because in tournaments, consistency tends to be king. Whereas on ranked ladder, you can get away with just being a deck that has explosively powerful starts, and as long as you're winning over 50% of your games, you are going to make it up to Diamond 1 eventually, right? So there's not a whole lot I really feel the need to cover here that I haven't already covered in like my combo guide or any of my other gameplay videos, which if you're into Adventure Tenyi, definitely feel free to check those out on my channel there. But the ratios definitely make sense to me. Don't really see anything too anomalous here. So, all right, let's go ahead and move on back now to the outro, which I guess I'll just jump into without a cut here as we look back at the tier list again. And remember, again, we're seeing this particular list. We are seeing only the ones that are from community tournaments. But that's another reason why I like to go to the breakdowns, because they also factor in the ranked ladder lists as well. So if you're looking for that best bit of information, I would definitely go to the deck breakdowns here, as opposed to just relying solely on the tier list, looking at what decks are represented, and then looking up individual deck lists from there. Definitely utilize that deck breakdown tool. And of course, I will include a link to Master Duel meta in the description there. But that's about all the time I've got for this one. So guys, thank you so much for watching all the way to the very end like this. I really, really appreciate that. I also appreciate those of you who are commenting and subscribing. Very, very good ways to support the channel. And if you subscribe, particularly, you get a daily Master Duel video out of me. They drop every day, so you can definitely look forward to that. And of course, in the comments, I'm always happy to hear from you guys. I really love getting your constructive criticism and feedback. Let me know what you think about the tier list here and where you think certain decks lie when we're talking specifically about Wraith Ladder. As always, I'm very interested to hear your thoughts. But that's going to be all for this one. Without further ado, this is Eldlich signing out. Hope you guys have a fantastic day.